Hello, class. Professor Mandeville back. This is lecture number 4 for History 102. And we need to pick up with what's going to happen in the year of 1866. As I mentioned at the tail end of the last lecture, what's really going to take place here is basically a political war between Congress and President Andrew Johnson. So, this all begins in early 1866, in fact, February, when Congress has to extend the Freedmen Bureau. When they originally created it, they only created it to last 1 year. And at the time, they thought that might be enough, but obviously it isn't, and the Freedmen Bureau is going to exist well into the 1870s. But they needed to reauthorize the Freedmen Bureau. So General Howard, who's in charge of it, came and testified to Congress about what he'd been doing, what he wanted to do in the future, and so forth. And we mentioned last class that he'd figured out that a key component to his task was education. So, Congress, it's sort of a no-brainer. They will pass the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau. It's sent over to the White House to President Johnson for his signature. And much to the surprise of everyone, Johnson will veto the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, Congress is kind of left scratching their heads, but this sort of gives you an idea of the deep down nature of Johnson. From what I've read about him, besides being a woeful politician, deep down he was a racist also. So, Congress will, as you know how the process works, no doubt, it requires a 2/3 majority in both houses to override a presidential veto. And that's exactly what Congress will do, and they'll override his veto, and that will reauthorize the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, this is significant because this is the first time in American history that a presidential veto had been overridden. In fact, up to that point in history, there weren't a lot of vetoes even cast. We went all the way to President Jefferson before there were any vetoes, and it wasn't something that presidents typically used very often. So, the next thing that Congress will pick up with in early 1866 is after they heard about the horrors of... Sorry, my iPad fell down. After they heard about the horrors of the black codes and so forth that were going on in the South, they're going to pass the Civil Rights Bill of 1866. What this law is going to do is actually grant to the freedmen citizenship in the United States. It was unclear at this point whether or not they actually had citizenship. To many, it was, not up for even debate, but obviously Southerners and others were arguing that they weren't even citizens. So they'll pass this law, which will also make most of the components contained in all those black codes completely illegal once you grant the freedmen citizenship. Obviously, they're going to be able to serve on juries, testify in courts, and things like that they couldn't under the black codes. So, it's passed by Congress, goes to the president for his signature, and once again, he will veto it. Now, this really angers Congress. First, the Freedmen's Bureau, now the Civil Rights Bill of 1866. They very quickly override his veto, and as I mentioned before, veto had never been overridden Now we have two in a matter of a couple months. So it's an all-out political war between Congress and the president. So the next thing Congress will do in 1866 is they'll pass the second of what's known as the Civil War Amendments. There's 3 amendments passed as a result of the Civil War. The 13th, which abolishes slavery. The 14th, which we're going to talk about in detail here in a moment. And then the 15th Amendment, which will grant African American males the right to vote. And we'll talk about that in a little bit in more detail later on. So, the 14th Amendment, and I want to refresh your memory in case you forgot what you were taught in PSC 100 or high school, how the amendment process works. An amendment to the Constitution, the typical route that it takes, is it has to pass with a 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate. Then step 2, it goes to state legislatures, and once 3/4 of the state legislatures pass it, it becomes part of the Constitution. If 3/4 of the state legislatures do not pass it, it's rejected and it's never added. Now, one thing that I also want to point out is presidents have no formal input into an amendment. They can't veto it. It's already been passed with the 2/3 majority in both houses, so you could basically say it's veto-proof to begin with. So, presidents can either campaign in favor of or against it or encourage passage or whatever, but as far as formal actual input, they have none. So, they're going to pass the 14th Amendment, so it's going to go to the states for ratification. Now, before we talk about that crazy process, let's take a look in your book. You have a copy of the Constitution in the appendix of your book, and the 14th Amendment is on page A40 in the back of your book. So, when we take a look at the 14th Amendment, there are 5 sections to the 14th Amendment. Section 1 basically grants everybody full-fledged citizenship if you're born in the United States. So this will end any controversy whatsoever of whether or not the freedmen are citizens. But part of it, of the 14th Amendment, is privileges and immunities, as it's known in Section 1. And what this really means is, and it applies to all Americans, not just the freedmen, that we can live in any state that we choose. And a state cannot deny us the right to move to their state. So, in state and local government, I teach the students that all Americans sort of have this concept internally in the United States of dual citizenship. Now, it has nothing to do with being a citizen of 2 different countries. What I'm talking about is most of us are first and foremost U.S. citizens. Then you're a citizen of the state that you decide to reside in. So most of us are New Yorkers. But if we decide tomorrow we want to pack up and move to Oregon, well then so be it. That's our choice. We don't have to ask the state of Oregon permission. We just pack up and move. Now, what was going on in the South right after the Civil War, southern states were setting up roadblocks between states. And when freedmen tried to, for example, a freedman might have found out that his family, part of it had been sold and is living in Alabama, and he was in Mississippi. So he wanted to go to Alabama and find his family, but officials at the border would stop him and basically question him and say, nope, sorry, we've got enough freedmen in our state. You go right back to Mississippi where you came from. You're not allowed here. 14th Amendment makes that unconstitutional. And it's something we just take for granted today. The second section of the 14th Amendment has to do with something known as the 3/5 Compromise that was contained in the original Constitution, where they counted slaves as 3/5 of a person towards representation in the House of Representatives. So every 10 years when they did the census, they would, the census, the real purpose of it is, we want to know how many people live in each state. We really don't care what the total population is, because that determines how many members of the House each state has. So, the way that they did it when there was slavery, and this was a compromise reached at the Constitutional Convention, was they counted all white people as whole people. And they counted slaves as 3/4 of a person. Excuse me, 3/5, as the compromise says. So, they'd add the two together, that'd be the population of the state. So, once there is no slavery, there's no 3/5 compromise anymore. But, according to Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, if they withhold the vote from the freedmen in the South especially, then the 3/5 compromise kicks back in, and it will punish that state by lowering the number of their representation. Now, another portion of the 14th Amendment is that it's going to restrict high-ranking Confederates from being members of Congress or holding high office in the national government or state government. So, remember, we talked about last class, after they, under President Johnson's Reconstruction scheme, the vice president of the Confederacy was elected in Georgia as a member of Congress. Well, this makes that unconstitutional. Now, the fourth section deals with something that Johnson had been sort of bannering around and basically teasing the South with, I suppose you could say. But if he'd had his way, it might not have been just a political tease. It's the Confederate debt. The Confederacy went into a tremendous amount of debt. They issued bonds during the Civil War to raise revenue to pay for equipment and men and so, to pay the men and so forth. Well, they're still sitting on this debt. And Johnson had said in several speeches that he intended to make good on the Confederate debt. Well, that's something that Northern members of the House and Senate would never, ever agree to. You're the loser, you lose everything. Those Confederate war bonds and Confederate money is worthless, and it's going to remain that way. So, they add it right into the Constitution that it would be unconstitutional for the United States government to pay off the Confederate war debt. So, the final section, Section 5, basically says Congress has the power to enforce all the above with any legislation they see fit. So it's an enforcement clause. Some amendments have enforcement clauses. So, 14th Amendment's passed by Congress. It's on to the states for ratification. And President Johnson decides that he's going to go on a speaking tour and try to convince states to vote against the 14th Amendment, state legislatures. Now, obviously, it's not going to take much convincing in the South, but he's got some crazy idea that there are places in the former Union in the North that he'll be able to go and convince to vote against it. So he's going to go on this, what we typically call a whistle-stop tour, where he gets on his own private train, goes from train station to train station, making a series of speeches, mainly in the Midwest. And this becomes known as Johnson's famous swing around the circle, because he does a circle in Midwestern states. Somehow or another, he thinks that one state that he can convince to vote against it is Ohio. What a joke. During the Civil War, our state, New York State, sent the most troops to the Union Army. Of course, we were the most populated state, but we were also full of, quote-unquote, damn Yankees. The state that sent the second most troops to the Union Army was the state of Ohio. There was no way in the world that Ohio's state government was going to vote against the 14th Amendment. So Johnson goes on this crazy swing around the circle tour, and when the votes all come in, all the northern states lined up, voted to ratify it. The southern states, with the exception of one state, voted against it, almost unanimously in many cases. The one state that voted in favor of the 14th Amendment was also a real slap in the face to President Andrew Johnson. That was his home state of Tennessee. Even they thought he was a crackpot. So, the 14th Amendment will become the law of the land, ultimately, and Johnson's feeble attempt to defeat it goes up in flames for him when he has the embarrassment of losing his own home state. So, the next big thing that happens in 1866 is the midterm election. It's halfway through what was originally President Lincoln's second term, because he was reelected in 1864. So all the members of the House are up for reelection, and 1/3 of the Senate is in question. So, what's going to happen in this election? It's sort of a referendum on President Johnson himself. The Republican Party, which remembers the Party of the Union, the Party of the Freedmen, the Party of anti-slavery, and so forth at this point in history, is going to win an unprecedented 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate. Now, that doesn't happen very often in American history. And in fact, when this does happen, the group of Republicans that are going to dominate this are a group of Republicans known as the Radical Republicans. These are Republican leaders who are going to end up in leadership positions, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, that are fed up with President Johnson, and they want to once and for all really punish the South for the Civil War. Because as far as they're concerned, that horrible event in our history was their fault. So, let me tell you a little bit about the leadership of the Radical Republicans. In 1867, when all the new members and so forth are sworn in, they have to select new leadership in the Senate and the House. So in the Senate, the leader of the Senate position, just like today, is known as the Senate Majority Leader. So the Senate Majority Leader, who's a radical Republican, no doubt, is going to be Senator Charles Sumner of the state of Massachusetts. Here's a little bit of history on Sumner that, if any of you took History 101, you'll remember this. Back in 1856, before the Civil War started, there was a very fiery debate in Congress over the Kansas-Nebraska Acts. Now, Senator Sumner was a senator then. He had condemned one of his colleagues from South Carolina and made some, snide remarks in a debate. And after this became known, a member of the House from South Carolina came bursting into the Senate with a cane in his hand. And he found Senator Sumner seated at his desk in the Senate, and he took that cane and beat the living hell out of him with it. This is known as the famous caning of Senator Sumner by Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina. He beat Senator Sumner so badly with that cane that it took him 2 years to recover before he could come back and do his duties in the Senate. Now, Preston Brooks was, grabbed by security or the sergeant at arms in the Senate, ushered out, but nothing really happened to him. He wasn't prosecuted for assault or anything like that. And in fact, he became a folk hero back in South Carolina. And one of his constituents was so happy with him caning Senator Sumner that he sent him a gold-handled whip with a note attached to it saying, "Next time, use this on those rascals from the north." So, he's going to be the leader of the Senate. And he's a guy with a bone to pick with the Confederacy, as you may suspect. We'll talk about how he gets back, especially at South Carolina, in a little bit. The leader of the House of Representatives, or the Speaker of the House, and there's a portrait of him in your textbook in the chapter we're covering, is the famous Congressman Thaddeus Stevens from Pennsylvania. Thaddeus Stevens was a champion of, before they were free, African-American slaves. He was a great friend of them. He was a participant in the Underground Railroad. He was being also an attorney. He used to defend runaway slaves who were apprehended by slave catchers, free of charge or pro bono as it's known. And also to give you an idea of how committed he was to the cause, he was married to an African-American woman. Now, he's a white man. That didn't happen very often back in the 1850s, that's for sure. And in his will, he demanded that he be buried next to his wife in the all-black cemetery. Because back in this day and age, even in the North, they had segregated cemeteries, if you can believe it. So, Thaddeus Stevens said, "My wife's going to have to be buried there, and by God, you're burying me there too. And if you have to go to court to do it, you can spend my entire estate making sure I'm buried right next to her." So, Thaddeus Stevens is also somebody with a bone to pick with the former Confederacy. So, this new radical Republican majority is all sworn into Congress in early 1867, and they're going to get right to work on punishing the former Confederacy. So, I'm going to take a break now, get a drink of water, I'm losing my voice, and I'll come back and pick up with the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867. So, I'll be talking to you real shortly. See you soon.